Good morning. This hearing will come to order. I want to first of all welcome our distinguished panel here, our witnesses. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your thoughtful testimony. Thank you for your service to this nation. When I took over chairmanship of this committee, was it about 10 months ago, the first thing I did is I reached out to Senator Carper, another person of real integrity, and I suggested we do something maybe a little unusual for a Senate committee. We developed a mission statement. I guess that's my business and my manufacturing background. And so we came up with one that's pretty simple. It's simply to enhance the economic and national security of America. I think that accomplished two things. First of all, it starts our relationship as a ranking member and chairman and as a committee on an area of agreement. I mean, who could disagree with that? It also directed the activity of our committee. And so the other thing we did is we established we've got really kind of two committees in one, Homeland Security and then Government Affairs. But on the Homeland Security side, and that's what this hearing's all about, we established some basic priorities. And not in any particular order, we established 5. Border security, cybersecurity, protecting our critical infrastructure, including our electrical grid, doing whatever we can to counter violent extremists, Islamic terrorists, whose threat, Director, in your testimony, you say is growing. And then our 5th priority was really kind of directed at the Secretary, but I'll include both you gentlemen as well. Doing everything we can, committing this committee to help you achieve your goal, your mission of keeping this nation safe. So again, I want to thank you for your service. It's exactly what this committee is trying to do. Your testimony, which I've reviewed, basically follows right down what our list of priorities are. These threats that we face in the nation are real. They're not diminishing. They're not receding. They're actually growing. And so I know you are, again, 3 men of integrity that take your duties and responsibilities very seriously. So again, I thank you for that. I'm certainly looking forward to your testimony. I want to thank the senators that are here. I'm looking for a very informative hearing. With that, I'll turn it over to Senator. Thank you, Director Rasmussen. Obviously, the purpose of this hearing is to highlight these threats so that as a public we face this new reality, as Director and Secretary both mentioned. Obviously, we want to be very concerned about anything classified, but it is extremely important. Secretary Johnson, in your testimony, said, and let me repeat, but today the global terrorist threat is more decentralized, more complex, in many respects harder to detect. Director Rasmussen, your testimony, the array of extremist actors around the globe is broader, wider, and deeper than any time at 9/11. Director Comey, we had a hearing called Jihad 2.0, really exploring and highlighting the problem of and the sophistication with which ISIL is utilizing social media. In that hearing, we had testimony that said that there were, at the time, somewhere between 46 and 90,000 overt ISIS support accounts. Now, I know Twitter has been taking some of those accounts down, but they just, basically pop up with another name, another handle. You talked about the social media, those individuals following ISIS there, then being moved over into encrypted accounts. Can you give us some sense of the numbers of people that you're concerned about that have been engaged in social media? And I do want to talk about your inability to track, but how much information do we have just in terms of the number of people that have been inspired through the social media, the open media, where we can track, into encrypted accounts?
Probably the best number I can give in an open setting is dozens. Yeah.
Okay. I would also, as long as I'm talking to you, and I know Secretary Johnson has also gone into the communities to try and engage the communities. And I know, and this is, I don't think, classified. I remember hearing in a briefing that the members of the communities themselves think that we've got a complete handle on this, that we know who among their midst might be being inspired by ISIS, that's completely false. Correct? I mean, is that, would you agree that that's sort of an assessment?
I do. First of all, I agree with you. I think Jay has been a leader on this, getting out there and talking to the good folks, no matter what their background, don't want their sons and daughters either going to the Caliphate, which is a nightmare, and dying there, or killing people and surrendering their life to a long prison sentence. Here, the answer is it's a huge challenge because good people do what good people do, which is we tend to write an innocent narrative over troubling facts. So the hair stands up on the back of your neck, but you say, well, I must be misunderstanding, or he must just be having a bad day, or I must not have heard him right. And what we're trying to get folks to do is when the hair stands up on the back of your neck, just tell us. Right? Tell any police officer, any deputy sheriff, we will check it out in secret so no one gets smeared. And if it's nothing, it's nothing. But if it's something, you may have just saved your child's life and the life of innocent people. But given human nature, that is an enormous challenge for us.
There was a New York Times article that really described an FBI informant operative really having multiple, I think hundreds of conversations with the terrorists from Garland, Texas. And the FBI had spent quite a few, I think hundreds of thousands of dollars for that FBI operative. Talk to me about the effectiveness of that. I'm just putting myself in the position of a parent whose son, maybe a 20-year-old kid, is being engaged with by the FBI, talked about different, the Caliphate and all that type of thing, and then all of a sudden the FBI swoops in and says, did you ever talk about traveling over to Syria? And a person's brought up in charges, convicted. I think that's a serious concern about, is that the best way to engage a community? And based on that, have we rethought that at all?
Well, we haven't rethought. We all agree, I think, that it's very important that we try to understand where are folks from this consuming to acting, make an assessment, and then take it very seriously, especially if they're moving towards acts of violence. And so we're going to continue that work. But knowing that we have to do that work, I hope should motivate the good parents of the United States. No one wants their children to go die in the nightmare that is this so-called caliphate or have to be locked up because they violated the anti-terrorism laws of the United States. And so it's just another reason why good parents need to talk to us, need to know what their kids are doing. One of the challenges we all face as parents, I have 5 children, is there's a sense that you want to know where your child's going physically. Right? You want to know if your kid's going to hang out at the mall, but you don't have such a sense of where they are online, which is the entire world. And so what we keep saying to people is when you see things that are troubling, help us engage and keep kids from getting to a place where they have to be locked up. We've done a lot of work, the 3 organizations at this table, to try and build capabilities. We call them off-ramps, so that if we can intervene early, when a parent tells us about a kid, we can get that kid the help they need. Sometimes it's substance abuse, sometimes it's counseling, sometimes it's religious guidance, so they don't have to become somebody we have to lock up. And so that's an ongoing conversation with the families of the United States. And we're making progress, but it's something we got to continue to push on.
Secretary Johnson, again, you've been a real leader in engaging the communities, and I applaud you for that. And again, I'm a little concerned about numbers, but I will say I'm surprised if it is only a couple dozen people been inspired in social media and then moved into encrypted accounts. Talk to me about your engagement with the communities, but also about that, your assessment of that number.
Well, first of all, by the nature of the existing threat we face, we are concerned about a lot of people who self-radicalize, essentially, by reading things on social media without necessarily direct communications between somebody in the homeland and somebody overseas. And what we know suggests that before somebody in that situation turns to an act of violence, there are very, very few people who are in a position to know about it. The parents, perhaps, a brother, a spouse, somebody that is living in the immediate home with that person. And so by the nature of the problem, we don't often have advance opportunity to interdict, to arrest, to prosecute, which is why I think the CVE engagements are so important, to build bridges, lower barriers of suspicion, and encourage people in communities, this is your homeland, to help us help you with public safety. And so we've been out there doing this. I think we've seen a lot of good reaction, some criticism to our efforts, which I think means we know our efforts are having an effect. But just heightening awareness and asking people for their help is fundamental given the nature of the current threat we have.
Just real quick with Director Rasmussen. Director Comey talked about the balance, the very delicate balance between civil liberties and security. And that's, we're always concerned about that. You talked about spectrum. Where are we today in that spectrum, in that fulcrum point between civil liberties and security, and where do we really need to be? Boy, that's a...
An incredibly complex question, and I'm not sure there's a particular point that that is a resting point on that spectrum. As Director Comey suggested, we know we are facing significant new challenges in the way we have traditionally collected intelligence to get at our terrorist adversaries. Simply put, the kinds of insight we used to have into some of the more complex al-Qaeda-linked plotting is just not available to us right now. And so naturally, in that environment, we're going to exhaust every opportunity we can, every avenue we can think of to try to develop new collection opportunities. Those will, of course, have to be balanced against all of the factors you described, Mr. Chairman. And that's an ongoing process, which is why I don't think we are at some steady equilibrium along a spectrum. I think this, as the director said, is also going to be a subject of an ongoing conversation with the private sector and the parts of industry that hold critical nodes of communication. And unfortunately, many of these terrorist actors are exercising their craft on these platforms. I think the good news is that we have opened a conversation. There's a lot of ground to be covered in that conversation without the federal government dictating solutions or as the director said, choosing a legislative framework at this particular point. But we're at the front end of that conversation, and it has to play out over the period ahead.
I recognize it's complex. I didn't expect a definitive answer, and it's exactly, your answer is exactly right. This is a conversation, this is a discussion we must have. It has to be an honest conversation, and we have to be looking at the new reality, the threats we're facing. They're not on the run, they're growing, and we need to be concerned about that, and we got to be discussing this in a very serious and honest fashion. Senator Carper. Thank you, Senator Ayotte. And again, thank you for your leadership on this heroin issue. If you remember during testimony in one of our Board of Security hearings, General McCaffrey said we're only interdicting 5 to 10% of illegal drugs coming in through the southern border, really indicating really how unsecure a border is. So I want to thank Secretary Johnson. By the way, we were talking about the border metrics bill. That report language will be done, I think, next week. So hopefully we can get that passed as a first step. And I'm happy to we've been working on helping you codify your strategy. So happy to ramp up those efforts and kind of work on those areas of agreement. So thank you for that. Director Rasmussen, in your previous testimony, you talked about the fact that we've taken a number of these terrorists off the map. And I guess I want to get your assessment of, the unfortunate reality is you take them off the map and they're replaced. Both the leadership as well as, the flow of foreign fighters seems to continue largely unabated. Can you just give me your sense of, how effective the people we're killing are being replaced?
I'll do the best I can in open testimony, Senator, Mr. Chairman. I mean, one of the ways we look at this as an intelligence community is try to identify who brings unique capability to the terrorist enterprise, whether that's from a leadership level, a high-value leadership target, someone who may have a very specific set of skills, perhaps in the in the weapons of mass destruction field or use of explosives, someone who has shown ability to organize and orchestrate significant large-scale plotting activities. Those kinds of individuals will be worthy of focused intelligence collection and whatever disruption capabilities we can bring to bear. Probably want to leave it there. Now that is an ongoing.
What about the flow of foreign fighters?
The flow of foreign fighters. There is nobody who is satisfied that we have yet turned the tide in terms of getting that flow to have crested. I will say, though, if there is a good news story somewhere embedded in this foreign fighter story, it is that the level of information sharing that some of which Secretary Johnson was talking about a few minutes ago, particularly with our European partners, is much more robust than it would have been if we had entered, at the point we entered this crisis 2 years ago.
The purpose of this hearing is laying out the reality, and so the reality is we haven't stemmed the flow the way we want to. Talk about a little bit about the significance of the Caliphate in the territory. And there was an excellent article written by Graham Wood that really was pretty eye-opening. I think for many people in Washington, we talked about that, Director Comey. Can you talk about that significance, again, lay out that reality, and why part of our strategy has to be to deny them that territory to really end this Caliphate?
And there's a couple of different features of the ISIL's declaration of the Caliphate that make it particularly concerning. One is, as you yourself suggested, Mr. Chairman, it becomes almost a magnet to attract individuals who are seeking meaning, who are seeking to participate in a global jihadist enterprise. And that is unlike al-Qaeda, who was often running their enterprise as a clandestine movement with a very, very rigorous vetting process before allowing individuals inside the fold. ISIL is issuing an open invitation on social media for people to come to the Caliphate and join. So simply in terms of size and scale, the declaration of the Caliphate gives us concern because it provides that magnet. But beyond that kind of somewhat amorphous effect, the creation of a caliphate and the control of physical space, as I mentioned in my testimony, gives a terrorist organization the opportunity to gather resources, to operate potentially in a safe haven environment. And while they are managing other priorities, it gives them the time and space to pursue more aggressive, ambitious external operations. Again, maybe of the sort even that al-Qaeda did traditionally. So that is, I guess what I would say, the part of the Caliphate that gives me the greatest concern is that physical space in Iraq and Syria that you yourself pointed to with your question.
So the goal of our strategy, with that in mind, really needs to be to deny them that territory. I mean, if you're going to degrade and ultimately defeat ISIS, you got to deny them that territory.
I would agree, Senator.
Director Comey, just a quick suggestion. I did meet with this young Yazidi woman, Bazi, who's had the courage to come forward and tell her story in terms of combating on social media, these young women who are actually inspired to go to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS. That'd be a pretty powerful way of doing it, just a comment. Secretary Johnson, we've held 8 hearings on border security now. We're going to hold our 9th. In a couple of weeks, we'll issue the majority report on our conclusions from those hearings. I think we're in agreement that, because we've talked about this repeatedly, I'm a manufacturer, I'm always looking for the root cause. And I think we agree, Senator Carper, that the root cause of our unsecured border is literally our insatiable demand for drugs. And it's been insatiable for decades, which has given rise to the drug cartels who are beginning to combine with transnational criminal organizations, potentially terrorist organizations. And so that's what we need to address. It's one of the reasons I pointed out the fact that General McCaffrey said we're only interdicting 5 to 10% of the drugs coming to the southern border, which shows you how unsecure our border is. So again, we have to lay out that ugly and harsh reality. I'd like to give you, Secretary Johnson, the opportunity. You've talked about the strategy that you're trying to employ, that you'd want this Congress, and quite honestly, a lot of this would come through this committee to help you codify. So can you just describe what your strategy is in kind of summary detail here? And again, I am completely committed to work very closely with you and your department to codify this in a step-by-step approach, which is, I think, the way we can actually accomplish it. Let's find the areas of agreement that unite us. But can you kind of lay that out and give me the priorities of the components? Again, we started with you need information to solve a problem. So the border security metrics bill, we're going to try and move that and get that passed and on the President's desk as soon as possible. But then what are the next steps? And what is your strategy?
In terms of pure border security, Senator, more technology, more surveillance to pursue a risk-based strategy so that we go after the threats where they know they exist. More surveillance, more technology, which was reflected in our FY16 budget submission. We need help in terms of speeding the process of deportations and asylum applications in immigration courts, more resources to accomplish that so that the time it takes to litigate is not as long as it is. But frankly, given you mentioned the root causes in this country, I want to mention the root causes that exist in Central America. Last time I was on the border, I talked to a 7-year-old girl who came all the way from Central America all by herself to Texas. And more surveillance is not going to deter a 7-year-old who's fleeing poverty and violence in Central America from coming up here. So my judgment is that we have to address the underlying causes in those countries. We talk about addressing the underlying causes for refugees in Syria. We've got to do the same in Central America as well. And so the administration's asked for $1 billion to invest in Central America, and I hope the Congress seriously considers that. As long as the conditions in those countries are as bad as they are, we are going to have the types of numbers that we have coming from Central America. And so I want to invest in a smart, efficient border strategy, which includes surveillance and technology on our border, but we've got to address the underlying causes too.
But if we do survey and detect, and we apprehend, and we process, and then we distribute and disperse around America, that sends a pretty powerful signal to Central America, if you get into America, regardless of what our laws say, if you get into America and we don't send people home, that's going to increase the flow. I mean, it's the problem right now with Syria, and we just had the president of Germany in. The more Europe accepts of the refugees from the compassion that we are as people to address that humanitarian crisis, the more they accept in, the more of the 4 million that are displaced outside will flow into Europe. The more the 7.6 place displaced within Syria will become refugees and flow into Europe. So we have a capacity in our countries to take people. You know, we're a nation of immigrants, but at the same time we have to recognize what incentives are we creating for illegal immigration. We also have to assess, and we're going to be going down to Central America, are there governing structures? Are there leaders, like we had in Colombia? Are there leaders that will actually take that money and use it properly to improve conditions, or are we just basically wasting that money as well? Those are legitimate questions, but I think we really do have to address as part of our border security strategy, again, assessing the fact of our insatiable demand for drugs, also look at every incentive that we have created within our law for illegal immigration. We've talked about this. The number one is work. So let's have a functioning guest worker program. So there's a host of issues, but I really, you know, we can control things here. I don't know how much we can control in Central America. We're compassionate, we want to help, and that'd be great. I'm not sure how much we can do, but we can do things here, and so let's make sure we're addressing all those incentives within our law, within our adjudication process, that are incentivizing people to come into this country and end those incentives.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, but I do believe, having spent my 22 months as Secretary of Homeland Security intensely focused on this problem, that a large part of the solution is addressing the conditions in Central America. It's reality, not simply as a matter of compassion.
If we can make those economically prosperous zones, you know, not havens for drugs and corruption, I'd agree with you. I'm not sure we can. Short term, there's some things we can do short term inside this country ourselves. Senator. Thank you, Director. You know, we talked earlier about, you know, the cooperation between your agencies and state and local governments as well, and I'm sure Senator Baldwin would agree with me as I talk to individuals in Wisconsin tasked with your mission, keeping Wisconsin but also this nation safe. They also are very pleased with the cooperation. So this is, you know, we're moving in the right direction. That's kind of good news. So I appreciate that. Again, I want to thank you for your service to this nation, all three of you. I think America is incredibly fortunate to have men of your caliber and of your dedication, of your integrity, serving in your capacity. I realize this is not a 9-to-5 job, 5 days a week. This is 24/7, 365 days a year, and all three of you are you know, working hard to keep this nation safe. So truly, I think I speak for all of us when I thank you for your patriotism and for your service to this nation.
I'm Tom Carper, and I approve this message.
That message. Again, there's an awful lot we agree on, and we're trying to find those areas that unify us. So this hearing record will remain open for 15 days until October 23rd at 5 p.m., so you got some time, Senator Baldwin. For submission of statements and questions for the record, this hearing is adjourned. Thank you all.